My name is Paul Bloom. I'm a professor of psychology and cognitive science at Yale University, and I'd like to welcome people to the Mind Report. I'm very happy to be speaking today to Stephen Asma, and I'll let you introduce yourself.
My name is Stephen Asma, and I'm a professor of philosophy at Columbia College in Chicago.
Excellent. You have written on Buddhism. You've written on phenomenology. You have a book a few years ago on monsters, which maybe we could talk about some other time. But mostly what I'd like to talk about is your recent book, Against Fairness, which I finished reading yesterday. I had read your, you published versions of this out. You've been doing a very good job of getting the news out. It's been in the New York Times, Chicago Tribune, Chronicle of Higher Education, I think. But I read the book itself, and I thought it was really, it's smart, it's well written, it's extremely controversial. I'm not at all convinced about your main claims, but maybe in the next little while you'll convince me. So we should start off by talking about what the book is about. You begin with, I think, an extremely arresting anecdote, and maybe you could present that now to introduce the idea of the book.
The way it starts out is I was actually at a conference, was actually giving a public lecture, and it was myself and sort of representative of the Communist Party and then a priest, and we were debating the nature of morality and whether or not the society needed religion for ethics. And then at some point in the conversation, I can't remember how this came up, but I was looking out at the audience and we were talking about weighing our obligations and our duties, and off the top of my head, I just said, I would choke everybody to death in here if it gave my son, an extra few days of life. And I was joking and laughing and sort of imagining this kind of Twilight Zone scenario where I would be actually posed with such a dilemma. But then at some point, I realized later that I did have these feelings, as sort of disturbing as they were. I thought, as much as I thought I was a lover of humanity, I had such devotion to my son that I had these almost irrational kinds of, a kind of hierarchy of values where he takes precedent over everybody else. And so it began to occur to me that I didn't have any kind of ethical language for describing this. I've been raised, on Kant and Mill and utilitarians, and I have a traditional philosophy background. So I thought, what am I supposed to do with these feelings? Are they just dangerous and heinous, frightening? And I thought, every parent feels this at some point. So how can we work this into the ethical conversation? So that's how I got started on it.
And so the conclusion you come up with, the idea of favoritism, somebody who read your book too quickly or just looked over would assume you're defending selfishness. But you're not defending selfishness at all. Rather, you're defending, you're against the idea of impartiality, a sort of expanded circle, as Peter Singer would put it, treating everybody the same. But at the same time, you're not in favor of just focusing on oneself. Rather, you believe that the proper morality will be sketched out over sort of a much smaller circle, your kin, your friends, your small community. And your claim, as I understand it, is both descriptive and normative. It's descriptive in the sense that you're saying this is how we're naturally put together. This reflects our evolutionary history, our neural structures, our hormones, and the like. And then it's normative when you say that this is how we should live. This is actually the right way to live. And I take it your normative claim is where there's a bit more of a controversy. So am I right in thinking that most people, that you see the descriptive claim as not very contentious?
Yeah, I think that's probably true. That a number of people have pointed out, well, we all are very dedicated to our kin and kith in a way, and that's obvious. And I do, in the book, try to explain why that is. There's recent effective neuroscience that shows us precisely why this bonding is so dramatic when compared with other kinds of social relations. But that's true, that it's the next step that's more problematic, which is the normative claim that maybe we should, in fact, have an ethics that is based in part on these more, I sort of call it tribal values, although that gets me in some trouble. I mean tribe in the most general sense, that there's a group, sort of an in-group, partly an in-group that's unchosen, in terms of our family, and then partly this group is chosen as you get older. And so a number of people have confused my view, as you said, with, oh, he must be pro-selfishness. And I'm very much against that view. I'm not an Ayn Rand fan. I do not believe that the choice is either universal ethics, treatment of everyone versus selfishness. I think what's missing is this huge middle ground territory, which is the set of values that we have around our kith and kin. And I think actually loyalty and favoritism is not selfish at all. It's highly selfless. There's a tremendous amount of altruism in the family dynamic, and it's unfortunate that people haven't noticed this in my argument, although I felt like I did a good job. But I think the mood in our culture is that there's a choice, and you're either for everybody in an egalitarian sense or you're for yourself. And that, I think, misses this huge middle ground territory.
So one thing that you emphasize, which I found interesting, is that in some way your view appeals to another ethical tradition. There's something in some way very multicultural about your book, which is that the standard, you're rejecting the standard Western view of morality held by most sort of people who aren't specialists, but also held by Hume and Smith and modern-day utilitarians and deontologists, which is what the anthropologist Richard Schwader calls an ethics of autonomy. And Schwader points out, ethics of autonomy is true for most people who write on the topic within our community. It's true for us. But for a lot of the world, they do things differently. They prioritize community, what he calls an ethics of community, or something, ethics of divinity. Issues of honor and authority and respect and family come into fore. So I get the impression that if you were to publish your book and direct it towards an audience within a very different culture, say China or parts of Africa, they would say, yeah, we agree, what's the big deal?
Yeah, that's probably right. Yeah, I lived in Cambodia for a while and also lived in China, and I felt like, as part of my job as a philosophy professor, I've sort of taught Confucius and Taoism, but when you live in these cultures, you begin to see that they organize the notion of the good very differently. And we, I think in the West, consider these kind of biases and what I'm going to call sort of nepotism as kind of intrinsically corrupt or at least suspicious. But in China, nepotism is the coin of the realm. It's how you get anything done. And these are what I call face cultures, where you have to give face and you have to maintain face and save face. And it's all your connections. The Chinese call this guanxi. The way the world works is you forge and create alliances with others, and then you draw on those in order to get things done. When we see that, we see sort of dangerous favoritism and nepotism, and we're sort of threatened by it. But if you look at Confucian cultures, they're based on ideas that are where ethics are not so universal, but rather more particular. They're sort of specific to who you are, who you're connected to, and even where you are in the family. The elder son has different responsibilities, different duties than the younger son. And so there's this great story that Confucius tells that sort of inspired the book in a way. He says he goes out to a outlying province, and the local politician comes and says, we're so virtuous here that if a father steals a sheep, the son will give evidence against the father in court and turn him in. And Confucius thinks about this for a moment, and he says, well, where I come from, the son shields the father, and the father shields the son. That's what we call virtue. And I thought, that is what I would do too, especially now that I'm a father.
Yeah.
But it's hard for me to justify that in ethical terms. I can only sort of talk about biases. So the book is a way of trying to bring in this stuff into the ethical language and conversation.
So to put another way, it might be seen as a reaction to those who would view your feelings that you should shield your son or your father as a moral mistake, a moral confusion, that you just got it wrong. And you're saying, no, that there's a deep moral truth in this, and it's something that's respected by other communities, and you want to sort of observe it and explore it.
That's right.
If you had to, you describe yourself in the book as a moderate liberal, which makes you like 99.99% of every other academic.
Right.
I take it your fellow moderate liberals, though, have not seen your book. I've read a few reviews from sort of more lefty sources. They don't see your book as liberal as you might see it as. Where would you put it in a sort of more American political spectrum. Is in some way, is this in some way an attack on certain views of the left, or consistent with the right, or how do you place it in that way?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. The book is called Against Fairness, and when you look at the way in which fairness is used in the American political culture, the people on the right mean fairness as sort of meritocracy.
Okay.
The person who's the most talented or who wins the race gets the spoils; they get the rewards. That's a very sort of right version of fairness. On the left, it's really more about equality, either equality of opportunity or equality of outcomes, sometimes the latter disguised as the former. But in any case, it's two different notions of fairness that actually frequently cancel each other out. So conservatives and liberals will talk fairness, and they're not even talking about the same thing. So part of the book is to bring that out and to show where the conceptual incompatibilities are, because as a philosopher, I see that as part of my job. And then the next step, though, is to say, well, there's actually another notion there's this notion of favoritism that flies in the face of both conservative and liberal ideas of fairness. We have favorites that we give way more to in terms of our time, our energy, and we expect more from our friends and family. On the other hand, we also have favorites who don't necessarily merit all this attention. It's not like they're the most excellent human beings you know. It just happens to be your brother or it happens to be your friend. Yeah. And so even meritocratic notions of fairness are violated by favoritism. So I'm sneaking in that sort of third category of favoritism as a way to upset both conservative and liberal notions of fairness.
Okay, and I think you've succeeded. So good. So now that we sort of situated the view, let's sort of spell it out. And the way I see it is you're making two claims. One interesting and controversial, but sort of sustainable. The other one much more controversial. The interesting claim is that these sort of virtues of favoritism really have merit. So it's not a mistake that you care for your child more than you care for my child. It's not a mistake you devote more to your child than to my child. It doesn't just reflect a limitation. Rather, this is actually a good way for the world to work. It's intrinsically valuable, and it might also be valuable in the sense that, given that the world is set up this way, it's better off for everybody. And in fact, in the expanded circle, Peter Singer discusses this, and he says, look, the fact that we take care of our own kids, we love our own kids more than somebody else, is actually, even from a utilitarian point of view, a pretty efficient way to do things. If I tried to care for each of the billion people on Earth just to the same regard, I'd be paralyzed. And that's the point you also make. So there's sort of that claim, which is that there's something good to this favoritism. The more controversial part of your book, and I want to make sure I understand the claim correctly, is that there isn't a virtue of impartiality. The title of your book is Against Fairness. That it actually is a bad moral system to have on top of this some idea of equality for all, equal distribution for all, impartial procedures that treat all humans and perhaps non-humans the same way, and that you reject this. And I think you reject it mostly because you believe it to be unnatural, so unnatural maybe that it's impossible, and if something's impossible, it can't be morally mandated. But am I right that your claim breaks up into those two parts?
Definitely the first part, I think, is exactly right. The second part, I feel like you've perhaps stated too strongly. Okay. And I'm not as negative about egalitarian ideals as you characterized there. Okay. My view is not that they should be thrown out altogether and that ultimately they're unsustainable. My claim is that they only work well at a certain level of human life, namely sort of institutional life. Mm-hmm. So I never argue against, fairness before the law in the sense of due process or anything like that. I just think that what's happened is that notion of the good, which works well at the level of the state and at institutions, has been brought down into the level of the personal. And it seems to me that most of the people I know and come into contact with are living in an ethical universe that does not involve statecraft or crafting national policies. Sometimes, we're involved in institutional policies. We're at colleges and universities and businesses and so forth. And so I don't deny that egalitarian ideals are useful. My argument is really that that is a kind of cost-benefit logic that works good in the realm of sort of ethical bureaucracy.
Yeah.
But that most of us don't live in that realm for the most part. And that if we confuse our own personal lives with these universalist notions of ethics that did sort of develop in the Enlightenment and sort of go hand in hand with the development of large-scale nation states, if we try to import that notion of the good into the personal life, we will miss out on this. I like this term that Bernard Williams uses. He calls these our ground projects, by which he means, there are these sort of meaningful connections we have with people that really make our lives worthwhile, and they're hard to sort of fit these hierarchic value systems. It's almost like my metaphor would be like a solar system. My son is like the sun, in the solar system, and strangers are more like Pluto, way out, in this far-reaching trajectory. And I think really our moral lives are more like this rather than a kind of grid of impartiality that can be applied to everyone. So my claim is it's not impossible to go for this stuff, but we shouldn't confuse the egalitarian principles with the way we're living sort of our daily lives.
Okay, that's really helpful. So you're not, if somebody's working at a polling place at an election and decides to give their best friends 5 votes and toss away the votes of their enemies, you would agree that's a bad thing.
Right.
Okay. And you would agree if the police, if the police let their friends go and everything, you should say, look, they should be impartial. So your claim in some way isn't that radical.
No, I guess I should really be claiming, the book should really be called Beyond Fairness rather than Against Fairness. That would probably be a more accurate title, but, marketing is what it is.
No, I like Against Fairness. And so your point is about the personal life. So, for instance, that I have excess money, you have excess money. We spend excess money on those we love, not those who have those strangers who have much greater needs. Your claim is that there's nothing necessarily wrong with this, for instance. And so you're opposing, say, utilitarians who believe that we are morally obligated to save others, that spending my money to buy my child better shoes and not saving some other child in Africa is morally equivalent to killing that child in Africa by failing to act. That's what you're arguing against.
Yeah, I'm objecting to that, yeah.
But your claim occasionally gets a bit more radical than that, because you point out, you have several examples which quite nicely point out that the personal and the public sort of blur together and institutional blur together. I'll give you one example of something you said which actually shocked me. And I'll give you a chance to either recant or to defend it.
Okay. Fair enough.
But we both teach classes, and we both grade. And you say at one point, and it's a very interesting claim, which really says that, you, of course, can grade by adding together exam 1, exam 2, exam 3, having a procedure, getting a number and everything. But actually, you're influenced by other factors. You have one student who you've noticed is a magnificent musician. Another one who seems to have gone out of her way to do all the supplementary readings. A third who's a homophobic jerk. And you imply that you factored this into the grades. And so my thought is, well, no, I think actually in your institutional role as a professor, you should not let those considerations that are probably not on your syllabus pervade your grading. That is a case of unfairness of the wrong sort. So am I being unfair to you?
No, I did say that, and I'll stick by it. I'll try to stick by it. The point I'm making there is sort of distinction between, let's look at teaching a large-scale lecture versus a small seminar situation. It's pretty clear that in a large-scale lecture, I cannot get to know my students in the way that you can in a small seminar. Right. And so I practice all of the classic fair. I treat it like it's a math problem, essentially, and the students are just variables, and I don't know them, and so it's just a matter of doing the math at the end and giving them the grade. That's how I approach that, because I don't know how else to do it. I don't have time to get to know them. However, I think what's happened is that our ideas of education have become increasingly like this. And that's partly because schools and colleges are bigger and bigger, mm-hmm. have to serve more students. And so my analogy is, it's becoming more like fast food, where you make the person at a fast food restaurant has a sort of formula, and they are themselves not, their personalities are not relevant. They just follow the sort of algorithm, and out comes the cheeseburger in the right way, or the French fries. What I was sort of contrasting this with was a model of education that's more like the apprentice-master scenario, which of course can only happen in these small mm-hmm. sort of settings. And what I was arguing was that in those scenarios, I've harvested, either intentionally or unintentionally, way more information about all of these students. I've learned about who they are. Like, I get to know them, they get to know me in a way. I mean, there's obviously there's a limit to this, but as a result of that, just from a descriptive point of view, lots of additional information has come to me. The example you gave, a student may not have done as well as I would hope they would have done in the exam, but I've learned something about them that's just incredibly impressive as a human being. It's hard for me to separate that out from my evaluation from them as their professor. Now, you could say, well, look, your job as a professor is just to give a grade, and you're just evaluating their works. But this was my point about the separation of public and private and personal. That is a very neat and helpful distinction that I think works great on paper and nowhere else. It is very difficult for us, possibly and perhaps impossible, for me to make that separation when I'm interacting in a kind of apprentice-master relationship with somebody. And what I'm claiming is these traditions of education are, of course, much older than the egalitarian mm-hmm. forms of education that we now embrace, and that by changing education into this purely fair egalitarian model, we've lost something. What have we lost? Well, like I said, I don't know the students, and in my evaluation of them, I'm not just giving them a grade that respects the work, I'm also sort of sending them all kinds of messages. When you grade a student, you're also telling them, when you get a good grade, you're telling them, you did good work, mm-hmm. I think highly of you, you have potential, I'm sending you out into the world with a certain insignia on you now that marks you as capable, and you will take forward to others. In other words, I think grading is much more complex and holistic than just this sort of instrumental, bureaucratic thing. So that's what I was driving at.
But there are a couple of things that blur together here. Like, first, you're right that in cases where you can't just do it by the numbers or by anonymous scoring, we're always going to be swayed by all sorts of facts, and maybe that's inevitable. And I think that's right. You're also right that in some classes you want to be sensitive to all sorts of factors, more holistically, as you put it, when grading the students, simply beyond aspects of their participation, their energy, their motivation, their interest, their potential, and so on. But you seem to be implying that other aspects of how you resonate to the student as a person not only do, but also should affect your grading. And I mean, we're talking about favoritism and in-group and so on. I take it we would agree that it would be unfair for you to give white students higher grades than black students because you might feel more similar to the white students and more connected to them. So that's obviously wrong. Same for male students versus female students or so on. But do you feel other forms of favoritism above and beyond competence should be morally relevant? Some students can be very nice to you. Some are going to be pains in the ass. They're going to be disrespectful and so on. But I think so long as they do the requisite work and everything and aren't uncivil to other students in the class, we should try our best to factor away from them.
Yeah, I mean, I guess what I'm trying to isolate is it's tricky because, of course, I think that there are forms of favoritism that have historically been very pernicious. and race is one of them and gender is another. And in no way am I sort of endorsing anything like that. I'm actually arguing in the book for could there in fact be healthy tribes instead of like tribalism being sort of intrinsically bad? Could we in fact argue for good and positive tribes? And I think I try to give examples of healthy and positive tribes. But I guess it's an interesting issue in classrooms. You know, there's the classic, there are teachers' pets, okay, and we all know that. But it's very relative as to why this person resonates with this teacher or why this teacher connects with that student. My claim is not that we should then try to eliminate all these biases as sort of intrinsically bad and damaging, and they're going to hurt the process of justice and fairness. I'm asking, like, well, what are the good aspects that come from these biases? Okay. Here's one, for example. When you have an apprentice and a student in a master relationship, what's happening there is a kind of favoritism. In the classic case, you know, like an electrician becoming a journeyman and this kind of thing, where you're learning pottery or whatever it is, where you're studying philosophy with Socrates, you're basically engaging in a much closer human relationship. What happens there is the benefit of having favoritism in that case is the sort of the wise person has a kind of a person that they can trust with their knowledge and wisdom. So they will dispense that perhaps in a more charitable way, in a biased way. But that also comes with much greater responsibilities to the favorite student. It's not like, oh, isn't this great? Some people, you know, the teacher has a teacher's pet. In the true master apprentice, it's a tremendous burden to be the favorite of the master. You've got to now shoulder and carry on the wisdom tradition that is very onerous. And so I'm trying to isolate those features, like in the same way that I was trying to find virtues in sort of forms of bias or loyalty. Here too, even in biased, you know, classroom settings where you have favoritism, I'm looking for the virtues that might get thrown out with the, you know, with the bathwater if we just treat education in a purely utilitarian fashion.
I like that answer, but it speaks to the sort of difficulty of curtailing the favoritism and the bias towards sort of your personal spectrum and away from institutional perspectives. Because, of course, when you're a professor, you're both. It's a highly intimate personal matter, but then again, you're also a representative of the university, and you're doing a job that people are paying and so on. So it's these fuzzy cases that are interesting. Let me jump to another case where my intuition differed somewhat from yours, but maybe not as much. Back to this first anecdote. So you say to the group that you would strangle everybody in the room to save your child's life, and I thought this. You know, I have two sons, and I'm very close to them, and yeah, I could imagine that. I see where you're coming from. I'm also enough of a sort of utilitarian to know that I've already done that pretty much. I bequeathed upon my children resources that could save the lives of other people. And I've done these resources not to save my children's lives, but just to so they have an Xbox and they go to a good school and so on. So I'm sort of with you on this. But then you step back, and I don't quite believe it. So let me change, since you brought this up, let me change the scenario a little bit. And I think I saw this in a movie somewhere, or a trailer. But suppose your son had a heart condition, of which, unless he was to get a replacement heart, he would die. And suppose this was possible, as maybe it could be, you could pay some people. And these people would go, and they would take another child, and they would kill that child, and take out the child's heart, and then save your son's life. Would you do it?
Well...
And I don't want to put this. I feel like this is like a mean question, and so you don't have to ask would you do it, but under the moral system you're talking about in your book, should you do it?
Yeah, I mean, people do scenarios like this. Obviously, this is a sort of science fictional one, and I am, in a way, when I introduce the example, I'm really just introducing an emotion that I'm having.
Yeah, it's
not so much like a principled position that I'm going to be killing people. But when you put it in this way, you know, of course I recognize the pull in two different directions here. And you yourself have done work on, you know, these trolley car scenarios where we have a kind of utilitarian brain which does a kind of calculus on one wants to protect the greatest number. And I think this is in competition with, as I'm arguing in the book, with the sort of limbic system, which is much more, I'm sort of arguing it's more tribal and primordial, and it's about the bonding that we have with our loved ones. So I think in a way your thought experiment is also about competing impulses within all of us, and even within the brain itself. But is someone in my position somehow justified in doing this? I don't know what to say on that. I mean, my feeling is this would sort of unleash all kinds of criminal behavior,
right.
Stamp it with a kind of ethical validation, and that's certainly not what I want to do. I don't know I don't know the answer to this. And in a way, I should also say that my book is not designed to be the answer to this problem, but it's really more the question. Why aren't we talking about this more? And so that's what I'm trying to do. I'm going to dodge your thought experiment because my suspicion is, first of all, I'm like horrified by the idea of hiring somebody to kill another kid. On the other hand, if you tweak it slightly, and we have a case where let me think of a scenario where I would feel better about this. Well, I can't think of a scenario where I would feel better about this. On the other hand, I can't shrug the intense devotion I have for my son, which makes me think I might do just about anything. Here's why I say that. Like, this is not by any means to justify criminal behavior, but one of the things that George Orwell said when he read Gandhi's autobiography was, Gandhi said, look, you can't be too close to any particular people, like in your family or your friends, because this will distract you from the kind of universal love that you must extend to all human beings. And when Orwell read that, he was horrified, and he thought that Gandhi had missed the point of being human, which was to have bonds that were so strong that you might be destroyed by those very bonds. So, and Martha Nussbaum talks about this with regard to tragedy. If you look at Hecuba, you see somebody who's gone through something that's so sort of, they have bonds so strong with family members or what have you, that to have those destroyed or compromised actually compromises their humanity and makes life not worth living. So I think those are the things that are at issue, and that's what makes me think I might do anything for my loved ones.
Yeah.
Even violate certain other ethical norms.
And to be fair, one could tone down the example. I mean, suppose my child commits a terrible crime, and it's the case you discussed before. Commits a terrible crime. I know he's not a terrible person. He has a reason for it, but it will put him in prison for a long time. I could imagine myself lying to protect him, and then suppose they arrest somebody else for that same crime.
Yeah,
and I think it's to the credit of your book to point out that this isn't obvious. It's not obvious, of course. There are pushes towards loyalty, towards loving your child that can't be reduced to a sort of simple cost-benefit calculus among strangers. Let me give you just one more example of a case which is also sort of meant as more of a challenge for you. Because the harder cases for you are those that blur the public and the private. I think we allow that we could favor our children, we could choose our own friends. And you and I agree that publicly policy should be impartial. But I'm thinking of the American Civil Rights Movement. So a lot of what happened in the Civil Rights Movement was that there were laws put in place that said, say, restaurants and businesses could no longer choose who to deal with. They could no longer say, we choose to serve white customers only. That became illegal. And at the time, people said, people have a right to associate with whomever they want. And this turned out to be an interesting case on the blur of the public and private, with the Commerce Clause coming in to say this comes under the jurisdiction of certain laws that it otherwise wouldn't. But to put it provocatively, do you think it was decided wrongly? Do you think that?
No, I think, this is a good point. The argument I'm making is that I agree. Race is a terrible criteria for a legitimate tribe. I'm trying to make this argument for, it may not be entirely persuasive, but in the same way that the communitarians sort of critique the cosmopolitan tradition, which sort of tries to see everybody as basically the same, maybe via their rationality or whatever, I'm trying to say, well, what are legitimate, more legitimate tribes, forms of favoritism and allegiance? And my argument is, well, it must be, among other things, it must be emotional bonding or affect that makes a legitimate tribe. I'm actually critiquing some of the horrible forms of tribalism that we've had along racial lines, along gender lines. I don't think racial preference, racial forms of preference or favoritism are defensible for all the reasons that have been pointed out for the last 150 years, that race is accidental, it's not essential, same in the case of gender. And my argument is that one should fish their favorites from the widest pool, most diverse pool possible. But when you've got your tribe out of that pool of diversity, then you are in fact going to privilege them, and you're going to have preferential treatment for them. But in no way is my argument designed to justify traditions of race, racism, or gender. I'm very much against those. And I think that's why I'm trying to argue that there's room for nepotism and favoritism even within the liberal tradition. We just haven't found out exactly how to do it yet, how to accommodate it. And then lastly, on that same point, I would say it's also the case that liberals rarely notice the very positive forms of favoritism that have even existed among racial in-groups and gender in-groups. If you look at the civil rights era, you could describe it as the unrolling of progress towards greater and greater egalitarianism. You could also describe it as tremendous African-American solidarity that as an in-group fought for its place at the table. And so the argument I'm making is there's in fact lots of nepotistic tribal allegiances that have done tremendous good in terms of social justice. I looked, for example, at immigrant groups like Mexican Americans who are very nepotistic as they trade resources across the border from my hometown, Waukegan, Illinois, and Mexico. They're very preferential, but it's very much a part of their, not just their survival, but their flourishing as an immigrant group within the larger melting pot. And so these also, I think, should be celebrated. It's not just that favoritistic groups are intrinsically prejudiced and negative. They're, in fact, positive and healthy forms of nepotistic favoritism.
You make it very clear you're not in favor of racial groups as sort of favoritism that you would want or would endorse. My worry is that I'm not sure how you could keep this from sort of falling out from all of the other claims you make. So you make a convincing case that in many cases the coherence of a racial group really does have good effects. You base the book, I think, plausibly enough with nepotism as your core case, or attraction to kin. But our attraction to kin, if we do have a drive towards kin and family, this is going to certainly influence us to prefer people who grew up in the same place as us, same family, often same skin color, same race. The psychological mechanisms that drive me to favor my family are probably going to have some drive to favor people who look more like me than they look like Chinese or African.
Well, there's a big difference, I think, between the kind of template of pro-social behavior that gets laid down in our first, few years of life, which is that's the unchosen tribe. That is going to be along racial lines in many cases, not always, of course. We live in a very pluralistic society, but you're right. That first tribe is going to be fairly homogeneous along racial lines. But pretty quickly, pretty soon, and this is the great thing about human beings, is that our biases are not hardwired. What's hardwired are the affective tendencies. The way in which our emotions then get assigned have everything to do with sort of epigenetic plasticity. We are born into a world with these sort of premature brains, and that those brains have access to tremendous amounts of information as we're growing up and experience. So experience is what shapes the subsequent kinds of tribes that we gain. So I'm very much for the most diverse and pluralistic society we can have. I'm just saying it's sort of the difference between prejudice and prejudice and postjudice. Prejudging would be sort of deciding who's in your group based on skin color. I'm very much against that. But if experience with people gives you a connection with them, and then you put them in your tribe, you have now made a tribe that's based on experience and emotions. And I mean that in a more sophisticated way now, not in your childhood way, but in the way that we live with people and go to school with them and interact with them. And in that case, I think that kind of allegiance is how we're already living. I would like to sort of make room in the ethical conversation for the power of friendships that go across all kinds of boundaries like race and gender. I think that's, of course, way too limiting, and in no way am I sort of in favor. I don't think that's an inevitable implication of my view.
But for any tribe, for any in-group, there's going to be an out-group. So I appreciate you're saying the wrong way to do it is for my tribe to be whites and the out-group to be blacks. But what about my in-group to be Americans and my out-group to be non-Americans?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I think a lot of that is inevitable.
Yeah.
Two, I think a lot of it is benign. I don't think it's all intrinsically bad. Then I think some of it is in fact pernicious, and the job as an ethicist for us is to actually demarcate which is which forms of tribalism are in fact unhealthy and lead to unfortunate cases of injustice. But it seems to me that I sort of give this example, you can identify, it's a very porous notion for human beings. I think tribalism is, of course, is much more locked in when you look at other primates. Although even for them, there's you can do some sort of swapping. And what is it that glues together a group? It's things like grooming and those kinds of activities. I believe that we can have in-groups with out-groups that we're threatened by and that we demonize and that we have xenophobic attitudes toward. We can also have in-groups where we recognize out-groups for which we have much more benign emotions and attitudes towards. I don't think it's inevitable that it's us versus them, everything for mine, and you are basically always a threat. I think that's a false dichotomy.
Okay. So let me raise another sort of more general, I think it's an objection, but also a way for you to clarify certain things against this view. So there's a sort of narrative of human progress that different philosophers and psychologists have been arguing for. Peter Singer, Robert Wright in a series of books, and most recently Steven Pinker in his book, The Decline of Violence, which he talked about on the Mind Report a little while back. And the story is that humans have been, over the last many thousands of years, been getting better in certain ways, certain objective ways. We kill each other less, is Pinker's main argument. We trade with each other more. Things like slavery and rape and torture still exist, but they are a lot less prevalent, a lot less approved of than they used to be. The way this turns into a challenge towards your view is that Singer, who talks about the expanded circle, and Wright, who talks about non-zero-sum coordination, and Pinker, who talks about the power of reason, all seem to be arguing that this is derived, at least in part, from sort of the expansion of an egalitarian worldview. Notions of human rights, notions of impartial procedures applying to everybody, the notion of the court, as Singer put it, going away from the tribe and getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And they would all argue, A, this has been happening, and B, this is a good thing. The world is better off as a result, that I no longer think so much in terms of tribes. And now I think more in terms of, say, the global human community, or for Singer, all sentient beings. So if that's true, then it's sort of a challenge to your view, I think, because your view would say, well, no, it's good to think in terms of tribes. It's good to go to favoritism. It's good to avoid impartiality in some context. And so I'm wondering about attention here.
Yeah, I don't know the details on Pinker's book. I know the general thesis, but is the argument that this is basically the result of the Enlightenment? Are we talking about just the last couple of hundred years is when this development of progress happened, or are we tracing it back to the ancient Greeks?
No, Pinker traces it back sort of from day one and argues that there are many, many forces involved, including the expansion of empathy through stories, the explicit notion of human rights, an ethics of self-control. But one thing that his theory does have, which is also has in Wright and Singer, is that the notion of who has value, the notion of who has worth, is expanding.
Well, I agree with that. If you look at the West, that is the story you would tell from, really from the revolution on, and it's been sort of hard won in many cases. On the other hand, I also think this is a story that the West tells itself.
Okay.
Because it plays very well into sort of Western exceptionalism, that it's certain ideas that came out of the West, like human rights and this sort of grid of impartiality that I'm caricaturing in the book, and that has given us peace, prosperity, and all the good things in life. I would say sort of two things. One, we should look at other objective measures of prosperity and human flourishing. And one thing I look at in the book is the Gini coefficient of inequality amongst those who have and those who do not. And I think it's shocking for many Americans to learn that the American status in the Gini coefficient is about equal with that of China, which is very surprising to them because China looks like it's all the bad things. It's totalitarianism, it's communism, it's not freedom for the individual and rights. And yet if you look at sort of measures of social science measures of human flourishing, those two places, the United States and China, are much more similar in terms of that objective measure. It's also the case that it's not necessarily true that there's much, much less corruption in democracies than there are in other forms of government. And so I think there's some question I would sort of draw on here in terms of like, what about more objective social science measures of things like prosperity and wealth? That's sort of a contemporary point. I'd make one more point, which is let's think more broadly about the American experiment is still quite young, relatively speaking. It's really a few hundred years old. And I think if you look at Chinese culture, which I'm very interested in, partly because I lived there, but I've been studying sort of Confucian cultures in general, we're talking about huge expanses of time. We're talking about, around 3,000 years of societies organized in a very different way, not along human rights, not along egalitarian principles at all. In fact, Chinese culture is very hierarchic, as everyone knows. And yet, if we were to sort of compare the American success story and the Chinese, I don't think it's obvious that there's just been this tremendous success story in the West because of human rights and democracy. I think it's way more complicated than that, and I think China holds its own if you look at things sort of historically, if you take a broader picture of Confucian cultures. So that's sort of my response.
Okay, cool. What's another aspect of your book, and maybe we can start to wind things down, but I wanted to hear you respond to this, was to skepticism. You're skeptical about the idea that we could use empathy to expand our compassion all to everybody. And so you're attacking Jeremy Rifkin's book, which I would hold up, except it's supporting my laptop, and it's enormous. And I find your arguments there quite convincing, but you're also skeptical about the power of reason. You're skeptical that we could use our reasoned deliberation to sort of, at least as individuals, lead better lives. I'm biasing it. Lead more impartial lives. And so why so skeptical?
I guess I don't want to give up entirely on it. I'm a philosophy professor.
I would think, yeah.
I spend time making arguments using reason, and I believe in the power of reason for persuasion. So I'm not a nihilist, and I'm not a sort of postmodern deconstructionist about reason. I do believe that the Enlightenment project has had tremendous successes. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, I think that I could sort of take a romantic interpretation and look at how the Romantics critiqued the Enlightenment, and eventually you got sort of Freudian ideas about, well, look, there's a huge part of human beings, namely the id or the unconscious, that really motivates human behavior, and that reason just sits on top of it. and it's just sort of the top of this iceberg, as it were. But I would look at effective neuroscience and brain science and evolution theory to make my argument. And here it seems to me that you've got the wisdom of sort of Hume all contained in brain science. You've got the old reptile brain. I believe sort of the triune brain model is largely going to turn out to be right. On top of the reptile brain, you've got the limbic system, the mammal brain, and then lastly the neocortex. It's my view that reason is powerful in human beings, and it's done tremendous good, but it's such a neophyte on the scene that the power of reason is built on top. I mean, if we could take modern rationality back to maybe the birth of language, so roughly between, let's say, 200,000 years ago and 50,000 years ago, that shows us that symbolic rational thinking is quite recent. Let's put it back at 250,000 years ago. Compared with the emotional brain, which is probably 200 million years ago, because this is when mammals start to evolve. So my own view is I'm a little skeptical about the power of rationality to solve all our problems, because I think that it is not the main motivator of human behavior. The main motivator is the emotions, and that we should build our ethics around some of our emotional capabilities in the way that Aristotle thought we should, rather than think that we have a kind of this sort of, prefrontal neocortical calculating machine, and that module is going to solve all our ethical problems. I just think that is missing the boat.
I like that. I mean, you're nicely summarizing what I think is the zeitgeist in my field of psychology, social psychology, cognitive psychology, developmental psychology, where the emotions reign supreme. This is what our brain has evolved for. This is our evolutionary history. And reason is this sort of fragile thing that sort of works to intervene sometimes. I have to say, I think it's entirely mistaken. And I guess the argument I would make is think about our success stories. Think about the fact that the most powerful emotional bonds, as you nicely put in your book, are between kin. The powerful love of that, say, a mother or a father has for their children. And yet, we're smart enough to create social institutions like the universities we work at, where people are forbidden from hiring their children. You cannot invite your child to take your class and then give them an A, however much you love them, because we're smart enough to devise systems by saying, yeah, I know that's what you want, but in the long run, this isn't going to work. We are by nature, I think, parochial, bigoted, racist, sexist, and so on. But we're also smart, and I would agree with you, these things stick within all of us, but we're also smart enough to create institutions to block it. And so the question I'm wondering, and I'm not going to sort of go the sort of, full Skinner and say that we can sort of modulate through careful engineering all of human propensities. I think some are here to stay. But even in our private lives, I think, I'm more optimistic than you that we can use our reason to change how we treat other people, to bias our favoritism a bit. Here's an example. I'll let you respond to this. I devote most of my money and my resources towards those I love and towards myself. But I do give to charity. I give to strangers. If I didn't give to strangers, I'd have more money for those I love. So this is a case of my egalitarianism, my impartiality overriding my favoritism. So it can happen to some extent. You describe in your book how you helped these people who you never met in Cambodia who got us in a horrible problem, but you didn't give the money to your kids or to your immediate friends. So isn't this both sort of a triumph of reason and also a challenge to the idea that favoritism is the most supreme virtue? My response would be that I don't think that's the triumph of reason or fairness. I think that's the triumph of a wider cast affection. So the example, I like your example, but I do this too. I'll tend to give, if I give to charity, it'll be to Cambodians who I know or people who I don't know who work in Cambodia because I went and lived in Cambodia and I feel a connection to that culture. But I think the real spark of humanitarianism, of philanthropy, is not reason and fairness and principles of fairness or egalitarianism. It's love. It's
it's affection, even a kind of favoritism, just cast in a different direction or outside the immediate circle. My argument with Rifkin is he's trying to cast it too large. I actually think that when I give money to Cambodians or when you give money to strangers, oftentimes that's motivated by this sort of Good Samaritan trigger. You feel like you want to help, and there's a kind of emotional connection there, and that's what's driving it. So I think the solution is not, and the charity in general is not driven by fairness and egalitarianism. I think it's driven by, well, philanthropy is like love of man, love of human beings. That it's that emotional connection that comes back again. It's just spread out a little more.
I don't deny that that's true to some extent. I think if you look at people's patterns of charitable giving, and the philosopher Appia points this out in his book Cosmopolitanism, people tend to give towards strangers who bear some connection to them. Writers might have helped the plight of writers in faraway countries. Religious people who are Christian might try to help religious minorities around the world, and so on. I also think, though, that rationality and reason can have a force. The money I give to, and it's nowhere near enough, goes to Oxfam, not because I have emotional connection, because I think then it could do the most help. I don't deny also that emotion could be a tool for triggering reason, just like reason could kind of exploit the emotions. But I guess we disagree over the extent to which it plays a causal role. Yeah.
Part of what I hope comes out of the book is like if we take one of those private public examples that I gave in the book is, let's say I'm an alderman here in Chicago and I have power over having a complex built, maybe it's a swimming pool or something for the community, and my brother has a construction company and I let him in on the bidding. Well, as a public servant, I see the logic of keeping him out of the bidding process to help build the swimming pool. Part of what I want to show is not, okay, you should just automatically favor your brother. I'm trying to say that there's a real tension between these two notions of the good. I think maybe I can serve the public better by taking a stranger to build this pool. When I do that, it is actually conflicting with my virtues as a brother, my loyalty as a brother. And I think the assumption in Western ethics is that all of these value differences will somehow harmonize in some beatific vision of perfect theory. And I just say, no, they're not going to. That there are real tensions between our notions of the good, and that's where the complexity comes.
So another title for your book, which would not work very well, would be A Defense of a Form of Moral Pluralism, drawing upon the Chinese as an example.
Yeah, that wouldn't settle very well, but
Okay, this is terrific. I really appreciate you taking the time to do this.
Well, thanks so much for inviting me. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Me too. Take care.
Take care.